He only had $50 in his wallet. And somehow, he walked into a place where even water cost more than his pride. The restaurant glowed in soft gold light, crystal glasses catching reflections like quiet whispers of wealth. The kind of place where deals were signed with a handshake and a smile that never reached the eyes. And as the door opened, a few heads turned, not out of curiosity, but calculation, measuring worth in seconds. And that's when Ethan Cole stepped inside, his shoes worn at the edges, his jacket clean but clearly old, his posture straight, not defensive, just steady, like a man who had already made peace with being underestimated. And across the room, seated near the window with the city skyline stretching behind her like a kingdom she owned, Victoria Hayes glanced up from her phone, her expression sharp, composed, controlled, the kind of woman who built empires and expected the world to meet her halfway. But when her eyes landed on him, something flickered, not recognition, not yet, but disbelief, quiet and immediate, and she checked her phone again, then the message, then back at him, as if reality had made a mistake. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered under her breath, her voice low, polished, but edged with irritation, and for a moment, she actually stood, her chair sliding back just an inch, enough to signal exit, enough to say this wasn't worth her time. But Ethan didn't rush, didn't wave, didn't try to prove anything. He simply walked toward her table, calm, unhurried, like a man who respected time but didn't chase approval. "Victoria?" he asked, his voice even, grounded, not too loud, not too soft, and she looked at him fully now, scanning, assessing, the silence between them stretching just a second too long. "Ethan," she replied, her tone caught between disbelief and curiosity, and somewhere behind them, a glass clinked, a quiet laugh echoed, the restaurant continuing its rhythm as if nothing unusual was happening. But in that small space between them, something had already shifted, because Ethan pulled out the chair across from her, not waiting for permission, not out of arrogance, but out of quiet certainty, and sat down, placing his wallet gently on the table, worn leather, edges softened by time. And when the waiter approached with that practiced smile reserved for high spenders, his eyes lingered just a moment too long on Ethan's jacket before shifting politely to Victoria. "Good evening, Ms. Hayes," he said, and she nodded slightly, still watching Ethan, still trying to place what didn't fit. "I'll have water," Ethan said simply. No hesitation, no embarrassment, and the waiter blinked once, then nodded, "Of course," and walked away, and Victoria leaned back slightly, arms crossing, her posture controlled, but her eyes sharper now. "You do realize where you are, right?" she asked, not cruel, just direct, and Ethan met her gaze without flinching. "I do," he said, and for a brief second, the noise of the room seemed to fade, like something unseen had taken a breath, because he didn't explain, didn't justify, didn't apologize. He just sat there, quiet, grounded, and somehow in a place built on status. That silence carried more weight than anything money could buy. Victoria did not touch the menu, her eyes still fixed on Ethan as if the paper in front of her no longer mattered. "This place has a $100 minimum per person," she said quietly, her voice calm but precise, like someone stating a fact that should end the conversation. And Ethan nodded once, not surprised, not offended, just acknowledging. "I figured," he replied. And the simplicity of that answer lingered longer than expected, because it was not defensive, it was not apologetic, it just was. And for a moment Victoria studied him more closely, the way his hands rested on the table, steady, not fidgeting, the way he sat upright without stiffness, like he belonged anywhere he chose to be, and that unsettled her more than if he had tried to impress her. "Then why come here?" she asked, leaning slightly forward now, curiosity slipping through the edges of her control, and Ethan glanced briefly at the window, the city lights reflecting faintly in his eyes before he looked back at her. "Because you said yes," he answered, and the words were quiet, but they landed with a weight that did not match their volume. And something in Victoria's expression shifted, just slightly, like a crack in glass that only appears when the light hits it right. But she did not respond immediately. Instead, she reached for her glass, took a slow sip of water, buying time, recalibrating. Because this was not how these meetings usually went. There was always a script, a pattern, Men who either tried too hard or not at all. But Ethan was doing neither. He was simply present, and that made him difficult to read. "You could have suggested somewhere else," she said finally, her tone softer now, less judgment, more inquiry, and Ethan gave a small, almost amused breath, not quite a laugh. "I thought about it," he admitted. "But I have learned that people show you who they are when you meet them where they are comfortable." And again, the room seemed to quiet just a fraction, as if the air itself paused to listen, and Victoria's fingers tightened slightly around the glass before relaxing, because she understood what he was saying, and more importantly, what he was not saying. He had not come here to fit into her world. He had come here to see it clearly, and for the first time since he sat down, she felt something unfamiliar, not superiority, not control, but a subtle sense of being observed in return. And across the room, a couple at another table glanced over, whispering softly, their eyes flicking between Ethan and Victoria, the contrast too obvious to ignore, and the waiter returned, placing the water in front of Ethan with practiced neutrality, though his eyes still carried a trace of quiet judgment. "Are you ready to order?" he asked, directing the question to Victoria, and she hesitated, just for a second, then closed the menu gently. "Not yet," she said, her voice composed again, but different now, less certain. "We need a minute." And as the waiter stepped away, the soft hum of the restaurant returned, glasses clinking, low conversations blending into a steady rhythm. But at their table, the silence was no longer awkward. It was deliberate, filled with something unspoken, something building, and Ethan simply sat there, hands folded loosely, eyes calm, not trying to fill the space, not trying to escape it, just allowing it to exist. And Victoria realized, with a quiet, almost unsettling clarity, that for the first time in a long time, she was the one being measured, and she was not entirely sure how she was being seen. Victoria tapped her fingers lightly against the side of her glass, a small, controlled rhythm that betrayed the calculations running behind her composed expression. "So tell me something," she said, her tone shifting again, sharper now, more deliberate. "What do you actually do, Ethan?" And the question was simple, but it carried weight, the kind meant to define a person in one answer, to place them neatly into a category she could understand, and Ethan did not answer immediately. He let the question settle between them, his gaze steady, not evasive, just thoughtful. "I work," he said finally, and Victoria raised an eyebrow, a hint of impatience surfacing. "That is not an answer," she replied, and for a brief moment, a faint smile touched the corner of his lips, not mocking, just quiet. "I fix things," he added, and again, it sounded simple. But something about the way he said it made it feel like more than just a job description, and Victoria leaned back slightly, studying him. Again, trying to decide if he was being vague on purpose or if he genuinely saw no need to explain himself further. "Cars? Houses? Computers?" she pressed, and Ethan gave a small nod. "Sometimes," he said, "sometimes people." And that made her pause, the faint rhythm of her fingers stopping mid-tap, because that was not the answer she expected, and for a second, she did not respond, her eyes narrowing just enough to show she was trying to understand what he meant without asking directly. And across the room, a burst of laughter rose from a nearby table, loud enough to break the moment. A group of well-dressed men, celebrating something, their voices carrying confidence that came easily when money solved most problems, and one of them glanced over, his eyes lingering briefly on Ethan before leaning toward his group with a smirk, whispering something that caused a few quiet chuckles, and Victoria noticed. Of course she noticed, she always noticed. Shifts in a room, power dynamics, attention, judgment, but this time she did not react the way she normally would. She did not dismiss it. She did not ignore it. She watched Ethan instead, waiting to see if he would react, if he would shrink, defend, or pretend not to hear. But he did none of those things. He simply reached for his glass, took a slow sip of water, and set it back down with the same steady movement, his expression unchanged, and that stillness spoke louder than any response could have, because it was not indifference, it was control, and Victoria felt something tighten in her chest, not discomfort, but recognition, the kind that comes when you realize someone else is operating on a level you had not accounted for. "You are not embarrassed?" she asked, the question leaving her before she could soften it, and Ethan looked at her, not offended, not surprised, just present. About what? He replied, and she gestured subtly around them. The polished tables, the expensive suits, the quiet judgment that hung in the air like a scent no one acknowledged. Being here, she clarified, and he considered that for a moment, not rushing to answer, not filling the silence with something easy. No, he said finally, his voice calm. I know exactly where I am. And again, that quiet certainty settled over the table, heavier now, more defined, because it was not just about the restaurant anymore. It was about something deeper, something unspoken, and Victoria realized, slowly, that she had been asking the wrong question, because the real question was not whether he belonged here, but whether she truly understood what belonging even meant. And for the first time that night, she did not have an immediate answer. The waiter returned once more, this time slower, more deliberate, as if measuring whether the table had reached a decision worth his attention. Have you had a chance to look at the menu? He asked, his tone polite, but carrying that same quiet assumption, and Victoria opened her mouth to answer, but Ethan spoke first. What do you recommend? He said, his voice calm, and the waiter hesitated, just a fraction, before listing a few dishes, each one priced well, beyond what most people would casually spend on a meal. And as the numbers floated into the air, Victoria's eyes flicked briefly to the worn wallet still resting near Ethan's hand, then back to his face, waiting for hesitation, waiting for reality to catch up with him. But it never came. He simply listened, nodded once, and said, "That sounds good." And the waiter paused, uncertain now, glancing between them, unsure who held the authority at the table. And Victoria felt that shift, subtle but undeniable, like the balance had tilted without announcement. "We will start with the grilled salmon and the house salad," she said smoothly, reclaiming control, her voice firm, practiced, and the waiter nodded quickly, writing it down. "Of course, and for you, sir?" he asked, and Ethan looked at the menu one more time, not scanning the prices, but the descriptions, like he was actually choosing, not calculating. "I will have the same," he replied, and again, there was no strain in his voice, no forced confidence, just quiet decision. And when the waiter left, Victoria leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharper now. "You do realize that meal alone is more than what you said you have," she said, her tone lower, not accusing, but direct, and Ethan rested his hands lightly on the table, fingers interlaced, considering her words without urgency. "Yes," he said simply, and that was it. No explanation, no defense, just acknowledgement, and for a moment, the silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, heavier, because it was no longer about appearances, it was about intention. "Then why order it?" she pressed. And this time there was a trace of something in her voice she had not planned, not frustration, but something closer to concern, and Ethan met her gaze, steady as before. "Because you should not have to adjust your world for me," he said, and the words landed softly, but they carried something deeper, something that echoed beyond the table, and Victoria blinked. Just once, caught off guard, because she had expected pride, or stubbornness, or even denial, but not this. Not grace, and around them, the restaurant continued its quiet performance, silverware clinking, low voices weaving together. But at their table, the air felt different, charged in a way that did not belong to wealth or status. And for the first time, Victoria felt the need to respond carefully, not because she had to, but because she wanted to understand. "And what about you?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Do you always refuse to let people meet you halfway?" And Ethan's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in his eyes, something reflective, something that carried weight. "I do not refuse," he said slowly. "I just do not ask." And that sentence lingered, quiet but profound, and Victoria leaned back again, her mind working through it, turning it over, because it was not just a statement, it was a philosophy, one that did not rely on what others gave, but on what he chose to carry himself. And for a brief second, she looked down at the table, at the polished surface reflecting the soft light above, and realized something she had not expected to feel that night. Not control, not dominance, but respect, small, unfamiliar, and growing. And when she looked back up at him, her expression had changed, just enough to matter, because now she was no longer trying to figure out why he was here. She was beginning to wonder what she had been missing. The soft glow of the restaurant lights reflected off the polished table as their conversation settled into a quieter rhythm. No longer a clash of expectations, but something more measured, more intentional. And Victoria found herself watching Ethan in a way she had not anticipated, not evaluating, not judging, but observing, trying to understand the quiet confidence that did not announce itself yet refused to be ignored. "You said you fix people sometimes," she said, her tone calm, almost conversational now, but there was a sharp curiosity beneath it, and Ethan tilted his head slightly, as if considering how much to say, not guarded, just thoughtful. "I listen," he replied. "Most problems do not need fixing. They need someone who actually hears them." And the simplicity of that answer settled into the space between them, heavier than expected, and Victoria let out a small breath she did not realize she was holding, because in her world, problems were solved with strategies, numbers, decisions made quickly and without hesitation. But this was different, slower, quieter, and somehow more difficult to dismiss. "And that works?" she asked, her voice softer now, less like a challenge, more like a question she genuinely wanted answered, and Ethan gave a slight nod. "More than most people think," he said, and for a moment, the hum of the restaurant seemed to fade again, replaced by something subtler. The quiet recognition of two people stepping outside their usual roles, and then the sound of approaching footsteps broke the moment as their waiter returned with a tray, placing the dishes carefully in front of them. The aroma of grilled salmon and fresh herbs rising into the air, elegant, precise, and undeniably expensive, and as the plates were set down, the waiter lingered just a second longer than necessary, his eyes flicking once more to Ethan, as if still trying to reconcile what he saw with what he expected, before stepping away, and Victoria picked up her fork, pausing briefly before speaking again. "You do not seem like someone who worries about how he is perceived," she said, and Ethan looked at his plate for a moment, then back at her. "I used to," he admitted, and that single sentence carried a weight that suggested more than it revealed, and Victoria leaned in slightly, sensing it. "What changed?" she asked, and Ethan's gaze shifted briefly toward the window, the city, lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass, before returning to her. "Responsibility," he said, and there it was again, a simple word that held something deeper beneath it, and Victoria felt that same subtle shift inside her. The realization that there were layers here she had not expected, stories not told, choices not explained, and for the first time that evening, she did not feel the need to control the direction of the conversation. She allowed it to unfold. "You have a family?" she asked, her voice quieter now, almost careful, and Ethan nodded once. "A daughter," he said, and something in his expression softened, just slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for her. And it changed the way she saw him, not dramatically, but enough to matter, because suddenly the worn jacket, the calm demeanor, the refusal to explain himself, it all connected to something real, something grounded, and Victoria looked down at her plate for a brief second, processing that, before lifting her gaze again. And when she did, there was something new there, not just curiosity, not just intrigue, but a growing respect that she had not planned for, and she realized, quietly, that this dinner was no longer about a blind date or a social experiment. It was becoming something else entirely, something she could not yet define, but could no longer dismiss. The first bite of food came, and went without either of them truly tasting it, because the conversation had shifted into something quieter, something that demanded more attention than the carefully prepared dishes in front of them. And just as Victoria was about to ask another question, a voice cut through the air from across the room, smooth, confident, and just loud enough to carry. "Victoria Hayes. I should have known you would pick a place like this." And both of them turned slightly as a man approached their table, tall, well-dressed, his suit tailored to perfection, the kind of presence that expected recognition before it was earned, and Victoria's expression changed instantly. Not warmth, not surprise, but controlled acknowledgement. "Daniel," she said, her tone neutral, measured, and the man smiled, though it did not quite reach his eyes. "I did not expect to see you entertaining," he added, his gaze drifting toward Ethan, lingering just long enough to communicate everything he did not say out loud, and the air around the table tightened, subtle but undeniable, and Ethan did not move, did not shift. He simply looked up at the man with the same calm presence he had carried all evening, and Daniel gave a soft chuckle, the kind that pretended to be polite but was edged with something sharper. "You always did have a sense of humor," he continued, addressing Victoria, but clearly directing his attention elsewhere. "Blind dates now?" And Victoria straightened slightly, her posture firm, her voice controlled. "We are in the middle of dinner," she said, a quiet signal meant to end the interaction. But Daniel did not step away. Instead, he placed a hand lightly on the back of an empty chair at their table, claiming space without asking. "Of course you are," he replied, his tone smooth. "I just wanted to make sure everything was going as expected." And again, his eyes flicked to Ethan, this time more openly, more assessing. And for a brief moment, the surrounding tables seemed to lean into the scene, conversations lowering just slightly, attention shifting, because moments like this carried a certain gravity in places like this, where status was often displayed without words, and Victoria's jaw tightened just a fraction. "Daniel," she said again, firmer this time. But before she could continue, Ethan spoke, his voice calm, steady, cutting through the tension without raising in volume. "It is going well," he said, and Daniel paused, just for a second, surprised not by the words, but by the tone, because there was no defensiveness in it, no attempt to compete, just quiet certainty, and that made him look more closely, reassessing, recalibrating. "I am sure it is," Daniel replied, his smile tightening slightly. "Though I imagine expectations can vary depending on circumstances." And the implication hung there, unspoken but clear, and for the first time, the weight of the room pressed in, not loudly, but enough to be felt, and Victoria glanced at Ethan, watching for a reaction, perhaps expecting restraint, perhaps even discomfort, but what she saw instead was something else entirely, something steady, something grounded, and Ethan simply reached for his fork, took another bite, and set it down before looking back at Daniel. "Expectations are interesting," he said evenly. "They tend to reveal more about the person who sets them than the one who meets them." And the sentence landed with quiet precision, not aggressive, not confrontational, but undeniable. And for a brief moment, no one spoke, not Daniel, not Victoria, not even the nearby tables that had subtly tuned in, because something had shifted again, something deeper than status or appearance, and Daniel's smile faded just slightly, replaced by something more measured, more cautious, and Victoria felt it. That change, that subtle reversal, and she realized, with a quiet clarity that settled into her chest, that this dinner was no longer unfolding the way anyone in that room had expected, and the silence that followed was not awkward. It was something else entirely, something closer to respect, though not everyone there was ready to admit it. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly against the back of the chair, the polished confidence he carried beginning to show the faintest crack, not enough for most to notice, but enough for someone like Victoria, who had spent years reading rooms and people with precision, and she saw it clearly now, the subtle shift, the recalculation behind his eyes. "That is an interesting way to put it," Daniel said finally, his voice still smooth, but no longer effortless, and Ethan gave a small nod, not pressing, not pushing, simply allowing the moment to settle as it was. And for a brief second, the restaurant seemed quieter again, the soft hum of conversations dimming beneath the weight of what had just been said, and then Daniel straightened, adjusting his jacket as if resetting himself. "Well," he added, forcing a lighter tone, "I would not want to interrupt your evening any further." And yet he did not move immediately, his gaze lingering on Ethan one last time, searching, measuring, trying to place him into a category that made sense, but finding none that fit, and that uncertainty, that lack of control, was something Daniel was clearly not used to, and Victoria noticed that too. The way his confidence no longer dominated the space the way it had moments before, and something inside her shifted again, not toward Daniel, but away from him. And before he could speak again, she did, her voice calm but firm. "Good night, Daniel." And this time it was not a suggestion, it was a conclusion, and after a brief pause, he nodded, offering a tight smile before stepping back, turning, and walking away, his presence dissolving into the rest of the room as quickly as it had arrived. And as he left, the surrounding tables seemed to exhale, Conversations resuming, the quiet attention drifting back into the background. But the shift remained, subtle but undeniable, like the air itself had been rearranged, and Victoria turned back to Ethan, studying him in a way she had not allowed herself to before, not through the lens of expectation or comparison, but simply for who he was in that moment. And she realized something that unsettled her more than Daniel's interruption ever could. She had underestimated him, not just slightly, but completely. "You did not react," she said, her voice quieter now, almost reflective, and Ethan tilted his head slightly. "There was nothing to react to," he replied, and again, it was simple, but it carried that same grounded certainty that refused to be shaken. And Victoria leaned back in her chair, processing that, because in her world, moments like that demanded response, dominance, control. But Ethan had chosen something else entirely, something quieter, something stronger. "Most people would have," she said, almost to herself, and Ethan gave a small shrug. "Most people are trying to prove something," he said, and the words settled into her thoughts, lingering there, because she understood exactly what he meant, and more importantly, what it implied. And for the first time that night, she felt a flicker of something she had not expected to feel, not just respect, but curiosity on a deeper level, the kind that does not come from intrigue alone, but from the realization that there is more beneath the surface than you initially believed. And she looked at him differently now, not as a man who walked into the wrong place, but as someone who carried his place with him, quietly, without needing validation. And as the waiter approached once more to refill their glasses, his demeanor had changed as well, more attentive, more respectful, as if the shift in the room had reached even him, and Ethan simply nodded in thanks. The same calm presence unchanged, and Victoria realized, with a quiet certainty that settled deeper than she expected, that whatever she thought this evening would be, it was no longer that, and whatever came next, she was no longer in control of it. And, strangely, for the first time in a long time, she did not mind. The plates had been half finished, the conversation now carrying a quieter weight, something more reflective than before, and Victoria found herself no longer trying to lead, no longer trying to define the direction of the evening, but instead following something she did not fully understand yet. "You said responsibility changed you," she said, her voice softer now, less guarded, and Ethan nodded slightly, his gaze lowering for a brief moment before returning to her. "It tends to do that," he replied, and there was a pause, not uncomfortable, but full, like a space waiting to be filled with something real, and Victoria leaned in just slightly, her curiosity no longer hidden behind sharp questions. "What happened?" she asked, and for the first time that night, Ethan did not answer right away, his eyes drifting again toward the window, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass, reflections moving like distant memories, and when he spoke, his voice carried something deeper, something steadier. "There was a time," he began, "when I thought success meant being seen, being recognized, being ahead of everyone else." And Victoria listened closely now, her posture still, her attention fully present. "I worked in a place where that mattered," he continued. "Numbers, deals, decisions that affected people I would never meet." And her eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition, because that world sounded familiar, too familiar. "And you left?" she asked, quietly, and Ethan gave a small nod. "I had to," he said, and the simplicity of those words carried something heavier beneath them, something not explained but deeply felt. And Victoria felt that shift again, the slow unraveling of assumptions she had made earlier. "Why?" she pressed, but her tone was different now, not demanding, just wanting to understand, and Ethan rested his hands on the table, his fingers still, his posture unchanged, because one day, he said, "I realized I could fix systems, but I was failing someone who actually mattered." And the words settled into the air with quiet force, and Victoria felt something tighten in her chest, because she understood what he meant before he even said it. "Your daughter," she said softly, and Ethan nodded once, and for a brief second, the room around them seemed to fade again, the noise of the restaurant dissolving into the background, because that moment carried something more real than anything else in the room. "She needed me to be present," he said, "not successful in ways that did not reach her, And Victoria looked down at the table, her reflection faintly visible in the polished surface, and for the first time that night, she felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel. Not control, not calculation, but perspective, and it unsettled her in a quiet way, because it forced her to look inward, to question the things she had always accepted as necessary, as unquestionable. And when she looked back up at him, her expression had changed again, softer, more open. "So you walked away," she said, and Ethan gave a slight shrug. "I walked toward something else," he corrected gently, and that distinction lingered, subtle but important, and before she could respond, a figure approached their table again. But this time it was not Daniel, it was the restaurant manager, his posture straight, his expression unusually attentive, and he stopped beside them with a polite nod. "Excuse me, sir," he said, addressing Ethan directly, something he had not done before. "I apologize for the interruption, but I just wanted to confirm. You are Mr. Ethan Cole, correct?" And for a brief second, Victoria blinked, the question catching her off guard, because there was a tone in the manager's voice that had not been there earlier, something closer to respect than routine, and Ethan looked up calmly. "Yes," he said, and the manager nodded, his demeanor shifting further. "I thought so," he replied. "We have been expecting you." And the words hung in the air, quiet but unmistakable. And in that instant, everything around them seemed to pause, not dramatically, but enough to be felt, and Victoria's eyes widened just slightly, not in shock, but in realization, because something she had not seen before was beginning to surface, something that did not match the assumptions she had built at the start of the evening. And as she looked at Ethan now, truly looked, she understood that this was not the moment things changed. It was the moment she realized they already had. The manager's words did not echo loudly, but they did not need to, because the weight behind them carried farther than volume ever could. And for a moment, the air at the table seemed to still completely, as if even the quiet hum of the restaurant had paused to listen, and Victoria turned her gaze fully toward Ethan, no longer observing, no longer analyzing, but seeing, truly seeing. And Ethan simply looked at the manager with the same calm presence he had held all evening. "I think there may be some confusion," he said gently, his tone respectful but grounded, and the manager blinked, just slightly, as if caught between what he had been told and what he now saw in front of him. "Sir, we were informed that you might be joining us tonight," the manager continued, his voice careful, "and that any arrangements would be taken care of," and the implication settled into place quietly, unmistakably. And Victoria felt it, the shift completing itself, the final piece of something she had not realized she was assembling. And she looked at Ethan again, her expression no longer guarded, no longer distant, but open in a way that was new even to her. "You arranged this?" she asked softly, not accusing, not impressed, just seeking truth. And Ethan shook his head slightly. "No," he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no attempt to take credit for something he had not done, and the manager, sensing the nuance, straightened a bit. "Regardless, sir, your table has been noted. And if there is anything you need, anything at all, please let us know," he added, his tone now fully respectful, before stepping away with a slight nod, leaving behind a silence that was no longer uncertain, but understood. And for a few seconds, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that mattered had already been revealed without needing explanation. And Victoria let out a slow breath, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, her thoughts shifting, realigning. "You knew this might happen," she said finally, her voice quiet, and Ethan gave a small shrug. "I knew people sometimes recognize things that are not obvious," he replied, and again, his answer did not fill in the gaps, it simply acknowledged them, and that was enough, because Victoria no longer needed the full story to understand the truth beneath it. She had seen it all evening, in the way he carried himself, in the way he refused to react to judgment, in the way he spoke without needing to prove anything. And now it all aligned, not as a revelation of status, but as confirmation of character. And she leaned forward slightly, her eyes steady on his. "You could have said something earlier," she said, and Ethan met her gaze without flinching. "It would not have mattered," he replied, and there was no arrogance in it, just clarity. "If I had to explain it, it would not be real." And And the words settled into her, deeper than she expected, because she understood exactly what he meant. And for the first time that night, she smiled. Not the practiced smile of a CEO, not the polite expression she wore in meetings, but something genuine, something quiet, and she nodded slowly. "You are right," she said. And the simplicity of that agreement carried more weight than any argument could have. And around them, the restaurant continued its rhythm, unaware that something far more meaningful than any business deal had just taken place. And Ethan reached for his wallet, opening it calmly, the worn leather revealing the same limited cash he had arrived with. And he placed it gently on the table, not as a statement, not as a gesture, just as part of the evening he had committed to. And Victoria watched him for a moment before placing her hand lightly over his, stopping him, not forcefully, just enough to be felt. And he looked up, meeting her eyes, and she held his gaze, steady, certain. "Next time," she said softly, "we meet halfway." And there was no negotiation in her voice, no power play, just respect. And Ethan considered her words for a brief second before giving a small nod, accepting not the offer, but the meaning behind it. And as the moment settled between them, something unspoken but undeniable filled the space. Not about money, not about status, but about something far more lasting. The quiet recognition of two people who had seen past expectation and found something real. And for the first time that night, the room did not feel like a place of judgment or comparison. It simply felt quiet. And in that quiet, everything finally made sense.